Religious freedom really is the first one that's spelled out in the Bill of Rights. It also seems to be one that faces quite a number of attacks, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to note that the founders made it the first freedom that they addressed in the Bill of Rights, because if you read the founders on the topic, they believed that religious freedom actually precedes the state, that it's an inalienable right that comes from God. It's something that the state doesn't give you, it's there to protect, and therefore they can't take away. But you're right that especially in the last 10 years, there's been a real erosion of respect for religious liberty as a principle. Increasingly I see the phrase appear in scare quotes as if it's a fake concept. And an uptick in cases all around the country related to religious liberty.
One of the cases that generated quite a few headlines in the past year or so involved the baker who was compelled to make a cake for a same-sex marriage, said, no, my religious beliefs forbid me from doing this, was taken to court, lost at the state level, but the Supreme Court ended up saying that it was true that he should not have to bake this cake, but seemed to open the door that further challenges of this type could be made.
I think we should expect that they will, and I think that's because what's really started to happen in recent years is a creep of this idea that religion is something that's only private, something that exists in the four walls of your church or in the four walls of your home, but it's something you check at the door when you go to work. It's something that doesn't belong in the public square, and that's a real move away from what the founders intended, and what that ends up doing is resulting in direct violation of conscience rights, which is what we saw in the case of Jack Phillips, and what we're starting to see in a lot of other cases. I mean, there was another big Supreme Court case this past term that related to pregnancy centers, most of which are run by faith-based organizations. One of them actually in a basement, one of the plaintiffs in a basement in a Catholic church, where they were being forced to advertise for abortion in direct violation of the religious beliefs of those running the centers. So that's just another example.
You referenced the founders. Remind us, what did the founders see as the role of religion in our society, in the public square?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, the founders viewed religion as an extension of property rights. In fact, Madison called it the most sacred property, one's conscience. So they viewed it as an essential and inalienable right, as I said, something that precedes the state. Secondly, they viewed religion as an essential bulwark for liberty. The founders were explicit, all of them, in stressing that freedom cannot exist without religion there to strengthen the virtue that's needed to maintain a free society. And finally, the founders recognized that religious pluralism is inherent to human nature, that we're not going to see religious uniformity. That's why they were opposed to a national established church. And they set up a system that left room for diversity, which is why we today have the most religiously pluralistic country in the world.
We are speaking with Ashley McGuire, Senior Fellow with the Catholic Associaion, also recent speaker at NC State University, on the theme, First Freedom, Religious Liberty, and the Constitution. We referenced the baker. You referenced another case that has been moving through the courts. What are some of the other typical challenges that we see to religious freedom these days?
Well, in my speech, I identify three areas to watch. One is the area of healthcare, where you're increasingly seeing healthcare providers being forced to do things that violate their conscience. For example, pharmacists being required to dispense abortion-causing drugs, or doctors or hospitals that are religious being forced to cover or perform things like transgender surgeries. So that's a big issue area to watch. The second issue area, I would say, has to do with public memorials. So there's actually a case that was just granted cert at the Supreme Court having to do with a World War I cross memorial, large, in Maryland. And there's memorials like this all across the country that are memorials to fallen soldiers, and whether or not that those memorials can continue to be displayed in public is being challenged. And finally, I would say the area of sort of gender ideology. So a big area where you're seeing the clash between sort of the culture and religious liberty has to do with adoption. So there are several big cases percolating in the country where religious adoption agencies are basically being forced to shut down or violate their religious tenets when it comes to placing children with same-sex couples. So that's another area to watch.
Some people listening to us, I think, are probably going to think to themselves, well, all these are signs of an evolving society, changing mores. Why should we let religion stand in the way of these various goals? Why is it important to protect people's religious freedom and not force them to go with what is now politically correct?
Well, first of all, religion is inherent to human nature. That, as my mentor, Seamus Hassan, who founded the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, used to put it, we're all born with our eyes fixed on the horizons. It's sort of natural to us to want to pursue, each in our own way, the dictates of our conscience and faith in different ways. That doesn't mean that everybody's religious. I'm well aware that there are a lot of atheists in this country. But that it's important that we be able to coexist with each other as different faith groups, and also with those who disagree with us. I think it's important to recognize that disagreeing is not necessarily discrimination. That you can disagree with someone about, the meaning of marriage, for example, and not be discriminating against them. But I think that religious liberty is foundational to any good, free society. And plenty of studies have shown that religious liberty also acts as a bulwark for other freedoms as well, economic freedoms, women's rights, things like that.
And people who defend religious freedom, I've never heard anyone who says they want to use religious freedom to stand in the way of something that someone else wants. It's basically, don't force me to have to do something that violates my conscience, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stand in the way of your beliefs.
Sure, and I think that's a common misperception, that people who are asking for religious freedom, who are wanting to obey their conscience, are trying to prevent somebody else from, accessing what's, rightfully their freedom. But no, I think it's important to go back to the wording of the Constitution itself. It's about the free exercise of religion. And that's something, it's very much an individual liberty. There's certainly a collective nature to it in that, but it's important to remember that religious liberty is a broad and robust freedom. It's one that entails and touches on a lot of other aspects of life. It entails religious attire. It entails speech and expression. It entails the ability to construct a house of worship. So it's a freedom that intertwines with a lot of other different civil liberties.